Hi, I'm Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute, and I'm very happy to host today Kim Ghattas. Kim, good to see you. Kim
Thanks
is
for
the
having me.
BBC correspondent for international affairs based in DC, and she's been covering the State Department, but over the past year covering the election campaign with, I think, the Clinton campaign, if I'm not mistaken. Before that, Kim worked as a journalist in the Middle East with the BBC in Beirut and covered Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, and has written for Time, for NPR, for the Washington Post, and currently has a regular column in foreign policy. And she's the author of a critically acclaimed book, I would say, quite a well-known book on Hillary Clinton, called The Secretary: A Journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the heart of American power. And working on another book I've heard on Iranian-Saudi rivalry and the impacts of that. So Kim, welcome. I'll also reveal Kim was my student at AUB many years ago, so we go way back. You've traveled around the country over the past year with the Clinton campaign, but also obviously meeting with the U.S. public and the U.S. electorate. Let's start there. Not so much commenting on the details of the results and so on, but how did you see the American public? What were they expressing? What's the range of feelings and views that you experienced?
You have to remember that I was, as you mentioned, traveling mostly with the Clinton campaign. I did not go out and report separately from that bubble. But of course, you know, I follow the coverage. I listen to the radio and a variety of views, to television. And I think it was fairly clear throughout the campaign that there were almost two parallel countries. There was the country to which Hillary Clinton was addressing herself, the diverse country of minorities, of African Americans, of Latinos, of urban elites, educated college voters, etc. The country that is leaning liberal in the case of the US, the country that has a demographic future that is inevitably more diverse. And then there was another part of the country, the one that ended up not voting for her, that felt slightly unmoored and unsettled by those demographic changes, and the country that felt the economic changes and the angst that came with that more acutely. And early on in the election cycle, I think already this was a poll in November of last year, there was this one poll by the Wall Street Journal and NBC that showed that 71% of Republican primary voters felt that they were out of place in their own country. And there was a lot of anger directed at the system. And I think that tells you something about where this country is at. And frankly, you know, 18 months later, after the election result, this is what we see
That's
being
come out
told, that
very
has
clearly.
come out very clearly. And I think for me, the result of this election, you know, as you said, we can go into the details of the nitty-gritty of how the campaign was run or not, or why she lost, and, you know, should she have gone to Wisconsin more, etc. But I think that there are two things that happened in this election. One, yes, there was the angst, the economic angst of the you know, non-college educated white worker or the working class in general, because, you know, African Americans and Latinos also did vote for Donald Trump. And that angst is on both sides. You know, Democratic white voters complaining that Hillary Clinton did not devote enough attention to the Rust Belt. But there was, I think, also you know, a last sort of ditch effort to push back against this diversification of America that is so unsettling to some people.
Yeah. How does the Middle East figure into the electorate? I mean, we all know Hillary Clinton's maybe policy choices as Secretary of State, potentially as President. We'll talk in a minute about the Trump administration and what might come of it. But how do Middle Eastern, this is the Middle East Institute, and we're trying to sort of address that angle of it. How do Middle Eastern issues figure in not in the campaign so much as in the electorate and how it relates to it. Obviously, issues of terrorism, issues of refugees were at least highlighted definitely in the Trump campaign. But as you've went around the country, and you're also of Middle Eastern origins partly, how does Middle East policy questions or Middle East community issues, Muslim Americans and so on, how do you see them appearing in these big political events?
Well, there are several layers to that, and some of it is connected to what I just mentioned. This economic pain and economic angst, this rejection of the diversity, is also a desire to reject the outside, reject refugees coming into the country, reject the unknown, reject Muslim Americans or Arab Americans, as though that is the panacea, that is the answer to making America great again. And it becomes this easy answer that Donald Trump has used quite efficiently to say, I have the solution, and it's very simple. If we just do this, this will get better. I think it was a very unsettling period also for Muslim Americans, for Arab Americans, for minorities in general, because the idea of the other became very dominant in this election, and that was very scary for Muslim Americans and Arab Americans in the country. And if I'm not mistaken, they voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton, despite the sense that she was too hawkish, according to some, on Middle Eastern issues. And it was, interesting even for me as an Arab woman from the Middle East who's, lived there most of my life, talking to some colleagues who are Muslim Americans, to see how this affected us personally as well. I was briefly targeted online and on social media because of that. I faced accusations of, being in the pocket of one political party in the Arab world or another that was working against American interests, but at the same time I was being accused of being in Hillary Clinton's pocket, so I wasn't quite sure how those two work together.
Yeah.
But I think it has to do also with what we're seeing in the Middle East and the chaos and the upheaval there, and the fear both in Europe and in the US that this is going to come here. And so it's best to move out of the Middle East, keep these people over there, because we Americans are paying too high a price for the rise of others, and trying to solve others people's problems isn't doing anything good to us. And that seems to be the sort of the bottom line, whichever way you look at it. And then, of course, moving, fast forwarding a little bit, but we can go back to this, when you look at some of the people that Donald Trump has chosen to serve in his administration, with the likes of Mike Flynn, who sees Islam as a cancer that needs to be eradicated, and has a strange theory of the world where Muslim countries, but also countries like China, are allied together and see history or Allah as a way to defeat America, and America needs to fight back against that. So it's always the other, and America's fight against them.
Defending against it. Let's move to the Trump, victory and the Trump administration. And I mean, how do you read where this administration might go in terms of Middle East politics externally? What might the impact be domestically? And then I want to talk a little bit about how do Arab governments, or Arab people even, deal with the change that's taken place. But let's start first maybe with what's your take on the president-elect's own approach to the Middle East, and then the team that he's assembled? What does it mean to you at the end of the day for Middle East policy?
I think it's still unclear to some extent. I mean, Donald Trump's understanding of the Middle East, as far as we can tell, is one that is very much based on his affinity for strongmen, right? I mean, he had a great meeting with Egypt's President Sisi just before the election at the General Assembly. When you look at the call he had with Nawaz Sharif of Pakistan, not quite the Middle East, but those kinds of countries that we come from, there is this affinity for strongmen.
For Putin, for Erdogan.
For Duterte. And I think that is deeply worrying for people in the Middle East who are suffering under these types of governments. I'm not sure how this evolves beyond this affinity for strongmen, because he's chosen a number of people to serve around him, like Mike Flynn, who's very unnuanced about the Middle East, like Mattis, who is all about Iran, and we'll have to see who his Secretary of State is going to be.
Zero in a bit on that. I mean, it's striking that candidate Trump, before he was elected, obviously said a lot of sort of positive things about Putin, of Russia, and on Syria, he generally leaned towards President Assad and let Assad and Putin deal with it.
Yes, and the reaction by President Assad was very immediate, right? I mean, he says we can make a deal with Donald Trump and the Russians to eradicate ISIS. Everybody in the Middle East is looking for opportunity right now, or in some cases fearing for their life, like the rebels in Syria. What is unclear to me is how Donald Trump, once he becomes president, is going to square two radically opposed things: his apparent desire to make deals with Russia, including in Syria, and his opposition to all things Iran. And Mattis and Mike Flynn are on that page. And how do you do that in Syria, where Russia and Syria are on the same page? Is there a way that those two things can evolve in parallel? I think we simply don't know, and I think he doesn't really know, because a lot of these views are being fleshed out now that he understands the enormity of the task in front of him.
And they'll have to make choices, and they have to
they'll
somehow
have to
become
make
consistent.
choices. Well, they don't have to be. They don't have to be consistent. They don't have to be
point.
consistent, and they don't have to be. They don't have to fit any sort of shape or form or tradition that we've seen before. I mean, look at his call to Taiwan, the president of Taiwan, breaking with tradition since 1979. That has rattled the foreign policy community. It could have consequences for China. I know we're at the Middle East Institute, but let me just finish the thought. It could have consequences for Taiwan if they suddenly discover that he's willing to make a call, but he's not willing to come to their rescue if they're suddenly at war with China. But he did shake things up, and there's a lot to criticize, but why not make a phone call to the president of Taiwan if you're selling them billions of dollars in aid? I mean, there is something to be said for shaking up, the way things are done.
And see what happens.
Well, shake things up that don't necessarily make sense, that are just these sort of, unsaid traditions that, don't necessarily make sense anymore, that are very opaque. But, obviously, you have to do that very carefully.
Another contradiction that, they'll have to work out, I suppose, is very positive statements towards Turkey, towards probably the GCC countries and Egypt and so on, and yet statements that are very critical of the religion, Islam. And maybe so far, okay, they were just campaign statements, it's just an occasional tweet, but what happens if things go beyond that, if there's maybe a terrorist attack in the US and President Trump reacts with strong statements? What happens to those relationships in the region, particularly that at that point the narrative, sort of the Christian nationalist narrative, would feed the radical Islamist narrative? So you get into deeper problems. How do you see that possibly?
You potentially get a George W. Bush administration on steroids.
Yeah.
Where you have a return to, an all-out war on terrorism that is of some comfort to some minorities, but not all, because I think it's becoming increasingly the case in the Middle East that minorities also understand that they cannot forever be protected by strongmen, and that there needs to be a different way forward. So it's of some comfort to minorities, to moderates to some extent, and of great comfort to strongmen who strive on that kind of approach, because it justifies their stronghold on power. People like Matisse might temper those kinds of ardors. I think they understand that an all-out war is not the answer. I think that Gulf countries are reassured by the appointment of Mattis. I still go between Matisse and Mattis. I think it's
I
Mattis.
prefer Matisse, but
Yeah, but it is Mattis.
Matisse, yes. I can't imagine Matisse as a defense secretary.
It would be very picturesque. It would be very colorful.
You don't have any guesses on the State Department. I mean, you talk to a lot of people.
No, there's been a lot of talk about, of course, Mitt Romney, maybe David Petraeus, John Bolton as number 2. I really think that it is going to depend a lot on these personalities that are going to come in and how they're going to work together. Mattis is a 4-star, Mike Flynn is a 3-star, but he's the national security advisor. Does he talk to Mattis as the national security advisor, or does he preserve the rank and, accept that, Mattis is still a 4-star general? I mean, who takes the lead?
What kind of family is it?
What kind of family is it? Is it rivals that are going to be, leaking left, right, and center, which will be, great for the media? Does Mattis manage to indeed convince Donald Trump long term that waterboarding is not the answer, for example? Because Mr. Trump has been very clear that he thinks waterboarding is a great thing, and he sat down with Mattis and he came out of that meeting saying, well, I was impressed because Mattis made clear to me that he could get more information out of someone just sitting around having a cigarette and drinking coffee. So he is open to some of these things, but it's always about who's the last person sitting with him and the unpredictability of it. Conducting foreign policy, conducting economic policy by tweets and with small sort of feel-good, razzle-dazzle events like, pushing Carrier to agree to keep workers in the U.S. Does he do, razzle-dazzle strikes in the Middle East that don't actually achieve anything other than feeding the ranks of militants just to sort of, make it look like he's doing something?
Let me end sort of going back to the people on both sides. And here talk about maybe think about the young people in the Middle East and so on. And they look to what happened in the United States and what's happening in Europe, actually. And in some ways, it's a big cultural shift from a very open West, which presents certain values and so on. The same values that we saw in many of the early events of the Arab Spring, and most public opinion polls in the region still tell us that most young people want to move in that direction, to a West that, at least as you said, in a big part of it, is becoming more closed, more rejecting of the other. And given that young people here and young people in the region are going to be the ones sort of making the future, as it were, how would you address young people in the region to look at what happened in the U.S., what are the positive things, how to move forward beyond sort of the shock to some of them of what happened?
One of my favorite quotes is from a book by Michael Mandelbaum. The only thing worse than an America with too much power the world will come to realize is an America with too little power. And America still has a lot of power, but it is less willing to wield that power. And that has consequences and an impact on, an NGO organization, a human rights organization in Egypt, for example. Who are they going to call now if they face repression in Egypt or, let's say in Russia or in Lebanon, etc.? I'm not sure that this administration here is going to be willing to come to the rescue or to wield that agenda. And of course, there's a lot of criticism to be directed towards, the Bush administration's freedom agenda that was driven from the top and, was mostly lip service as well to that issue. But I do think that people in the region are going to be looking for answers. They're going to be looking to America and think two things. A, who do we call now? Those who did look towards the United States for, moral guidance or leadership or assistance or whatever. But also they're going to think, well, where do we go now? And there is a silver lining there, which is that where do we go now? Well, maybe it's time that we really stay in our region. As difficult as it is, as much upheaval as there is, there has been a tendency to try to escape if you could. And I know that it's easy for us here sitting in Washington to say that, but we've both lived in Lebanon, we've lived through the war, etc. We know what it's like. So we're not just talking from the comfort of our chairs here. And I think, it is up to us in the region to lead that change towards what we want our region to be. And to work with those partners in the US that are still able and willing to give assistance for the agenda that we set, not that is set by a foreign power. But I think that what struck me most as I was covering this election is how much America started to remind me of the Arab world.
How so?
When, you looked at the reference to violence in language used by candidates. When Donald Trump said, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and people would still vote for me. It's the kind of language that we're used to from leaders in the Middle East. When Ted Cruz came up to the podium after his victory in Iowa and said, "To God be the glory." To me that sounded like Allahu Akbar, which is associated very much here now with militants, but is simply a cry, praise the Lord, whether joyful or sorrowful, etc. The Clintons and the Bushes, the sort of dynastic powers that remain, both of which have now been, I guess, retired. And then, just generally, I think, the conspiracy theories, the fake news, people, not basing their opinions on facts. Unfortunately, that is way too common in the Middle East.
It was rumors. Here it's fake news. It's actual news sites.
There's plenty of fake news now in the Middle East as well. I have come across it quite a bit. Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, another word for fake news is lies and propaganda, right? I mean, that's what we're used to
call it
in the Middle East. And now with the election result, you look at Donald Trump as the president-elect and you look at how he will conduct business and how much will revolve around his person and the business deals and his children who are still involved in the business. And all of that is a lot less like the America that we're used to seeing, even if some of that was still happening, or was already happening in the background, and a lot more like the region that we come from. So perhaps it's time for the Middle East to, take on the torch and show the way forward and revive the Levantine cosmopolitanism.
That's right.
That we really had back in the day.
Mixed business and politics and so on. So the silver lining is that the U.S. and the Middle East are looking more alike.
But perhaps,
closer together.
But it is time for us in the region to not give up on those values, just find a way for us to develop them and share them.
And also to recognize that people in the U.S. face similar challenges as people in the region in some political senses. You have to fight for these values.
Yes,
they don't
absolutely.
Just
I mean, I was speaking
exist.
to absolutely. You have to fight for these values. And I think people in the West, we need to spend more time explaining to people in the West the cost that comes from living in countries like China, Russia, Egypt, if you're not powerful. It comes at a cost, The rule of law is not something you can rely on. But absolutely, I think activists in the Middle East probably have a few messages for Americans. I was just speaking to Amira Yahyaoui, a very prominent activist in Tunisia, the founder of an organization called Al-Bawsala, which holds politicians to account. And she gave a speech here and felt that she had to give a pep talk to those in the audience and said, I can tell you one thing, in situations like that, you have three options. You flee, you freeze, or you fight. So fight. That was her message to the room.
Okay, well, thank you, Kim, very, very much.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Fascinating and a very enjoyable discussion. Thank you all for joining us. This has been Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute with Kim Ghattas from the BBC, who covers international affairs and recently the Clinton campaign. And thanks for being with us, and have a good evening, I suppose. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.